Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Dan, Warpaint JKU. This is not just another ball joint video, okay? I've done ball joint videos. This video is about solving the age-old problem on a Super Duty axle when you install new ball joints and you have memory steer. If your knuckle is hard to turn and doesn't turn like this with brand new ball joints installed, you skipped one very important step that no one talks about. So let's dive on in, check it out, make sure your ball joints live a long, happy life. Now guys, at the end of this video, I'm going to show you that one very important step, okay? I'm not going to take all the time to show you guys, like in all the other ball joint videos, how to uninstall them, press in new ones, pull them out. None of that has anything to do with this process. Installing them the final time, the torque sequence, and one other little teeny tiny detail that makes a world of difference that no one talks about, that's the issue. We'll get to it at the end. But first, let's dive in, talk about what the guts of a ball joint are and why this final little teeny tiny detail is so important. Now first, let's compare the Super Duty Dana 60 lower ball joint to a very common Dana 30, Dana 44 lower ball joint. You can see the difference in size in the cup on the bottom, and you can also obviously see the difference in size on the ball joint itself, okay? Now, a lot of people, especially in the Jeep world, okay, or in the off-road world, Dana 30, Dana 44, very popular axle. They put them on, they throw a set of 35-inch tires on it, want to know why they're failing so quickly. On the contrary, people with this ball joint want to know why they're failing so quickly on their factory Super Duty that doesn't even have big tires. So let's dive in, let's take a look at the guts inside of the ball joint to better understand it. But here's the ball joint, and I cut this one in half. Now, as you get in here and you look at this ball joint, you can see that it's non-greasable. This was a factory ball joint inside of a Super Duty Dana 60. They come greased, which is why they have that rubber bushing at the top right here to hold that grease in there for the life of it. Now, this ball joint was still in fairly good shape because I got this axle out of a junkyard and I have absolutely no idea how many miles were on it or if someone even had replaced them with a factory style ball joint. But, okay, inside of that cup, there's plastic. Now, ball joints are meant to wear, all right? Anything on your vehicle that moves, whether it's a bearing, whether it's your brakes, whether it's your tires, anything that has friction is meant to wear, right? That's why we put oil in our motors, but they wear anyway. Oil in our differentials, transmission fluid, those kinds of things. But again, they wear anyway, and they never last forever. Ball joints are no different, right? That ball inside of there is meant to move around and turn and rotate when you turn your steering. So that plastic cup that's in there is meant to last a very long time with some grease, but it's meant to wear. Now, there are some aftermarket options that replace that plastic cup with other bushings made of other things that last even longer, but they only last longer if they're installed correctly, and here's why. If you look at this ball joint, you can see the plastic on the bottom, and then you can see maybe up here, like on that outer edge, there's a little bit of plastic up here as well. Well, a lot of the time when you install ball joints and you have that memory steer, there's too much pressure on the upper cup, on the upper plastic in that ball joint. And a lot of people, if you Google it, you look it up on all the forums and things like that, a lot of people will say, oh, I got these new ball joints in. The shop said it'll just take a couple thousand miles for them to break in. Okay, let me explain something to you. Ball joints do not need to break in. Ball joints, if they're installed correctly, should turn like this. They do not need to break in. The reason those shops are saying that is because they didn't install them correctly. And when they installed them, you had that super tight memory steer issue. And guys, that issue is the reason they want you to take those couple thousand miles to break it in is because they're relying on the fact that that ball is going to wear out that upper cup, and then it's going to get easier to turn your knuckle. That's another reason why ball joints catch such a bad rap, right? People are like, oh my God, my ball joints, they only lasted me 20,000 miles. Well, if they were installed wrong and you had too much pressure on that upper cup, you wore it out too quickly. That's why. If you install them correctly, they'll last you a good long time, even with big tires. So let's get down to it. Let's talk about how to actually install these properly so that you don't suffer from that super tight turning and that super tight memory steer issue that they call it out there on the forums. After your ball joints are removed, it is very smart to get in here with a little bit of sandpaper and basically clean up this inside area so that it is free of any rust or contaminants, dirt, grime, anything like that. Then clean it with a little bit of brake cleaner. You also want to attack this the same way. Don't grind into it enough to change the diameter of it. We're not trying to do that, but this is pretty hard steel and it would take a while to actually do that. So you can be rough with it, but like, you know, don't go crazy with like a flap wheel because you'll eat into this thing pretty quick. But you just want to get rid of all that rust and clean this up so that when it slides back in, it moves freely inside of that upper C hole. Once that's done, I like to hit it with a little bit of brake cleaner. Make sure that they're totally clean and free of any dust and contaminants, things like that. Any oil, because that'll prevent you from installing it correctly. After you obviously have your ball joints in here, you have your rubber boot on the top, we're ready to basically put it back inside of the axle. Now, what most people do is they take that bushing that we just cleaned, they drop it in first, and then they start sliding everything together. And you can see here, there's no gap, right? It's just sitting up there. That's a big part of the problem. When you put this in first, it creates weird pressure on your ball joints. That does not go in first, okay? It's opposite. Normally what we do is we put a knuckle or a ball joint or, you know, a knuckle on, and then we put the upper nut on just a couple of turns to stop it from falling off. We're actually going to do that this time on the lower to stop it from falling off. Make sure you have it coated in thread lock and you do all your manufacturer's specs for your axle. But that's how you do it on a Super Duty axle, and it will make your job a lot easier. I'll explain. There's a lot of myths out there, okay? There's a lot of them about how like you need the weight of the vehicle on the knuckle, so they put a jack on the bottom of it. As you can see here, I mean, mine's on jack stands. There's no weight on it whatsoever, and it goes back together perfectly fine. So without further ado, let's get back to it. Let me show you the trick that most people miss and why their ball joints don't last. As we said a second ago, we're going to take our knuckle, we're going to slide it in. I do not have that bushing in the top, right? It's right here. I'm going to set it on the floor. We're basically just going to slide it in, put that lower nut on a couple of threads to make sure that the knuckle doesn't fall out just from its own weight. And we'll move on with the next step. But it's really, truly just that simple. So we're going to line it all up. We're going to lift it in there, put the lower nut on. Now, obviously, that bushing not being in there allows that upper ball joint to kind of just swim around in there, which is kind of crazy. So what we're going to do is basically take that bushing now and slide it in. We're not going to use a hammer on it. We're not going to do anything crazy aggressive, but if you notice, there's this flat spot which goes against this flat spot. You can't mess it up. We're just going to drop it on, position it, because I'm using one hand to film, and kind of just let it sit there like that, right? Now you'll notice there's that gap in there now, okay? That gap will grow as we start tightening the lower and pulling it up. Now the torque spec here is very important, but so is that step with that upper bushing. That upper bushing has to be free to slide in and out, so you got to make sure you clean it. Some anti-seize sometimes isn't a bad idea on that. but we're gonna tighten the lower now to 50 pound-feet. I think manufacturer spec is 44 on this ball joint, but my torque wrench only goes to 50. It doesn't go lower. So we're gonna do the 50 on the bottom, then we're gonna come back, we're gonna torque the upper to 69, and then retorque the lower to 150, and we'll be good to go. Watch how simple it is. All right, so we're in here. We're just gonna torque this guy 50 pound-feet on the bottom. Now we're gonna put our nut on the top and torque it to 69. After we go to 69, if the castle nut is not lined up with that hole for our cotter pin, we will continue tightening it until it is. Don't loosen it. But you can see how we have this gap up here right now. That gap is gonna start to get a little smaller. But if we had hammered that in and then put our nut on the top before, it would have not allowed the bottom ball joint to come all the way up, and we would have had that ball joint putting way too much pressure on that upper cup inside of the ball joint that I showed you earlier, and that's why it gets too tight. And then people sit there and are like, well, on a couple thousand miles it'll be better. Well, yeah, because you wore that crap out of that upper cup, and that's why then your ball joints don't last the life that they're supposed to. All right, but let's get back to it. We'll put that upper at 69. We'll retorque the lower to 150, and I'll show you how easily I can rotate it. Now, one step, and I like to do this just to make sure that this is seated all the way, is I do actually now hit this with a hammer, okay? I'm gonna put a socket on it. I'm gonna give it just some light taps. I'm not gonna go crazy. I'm just gonna give it some light taps. Put our wrench back on, and now torque it to that 69 pound-feet. Oh, that's 150. All right, we are at 150, and check this out. Look how easily I can turn that, and I didn't even grease these ball joints yet. There you have it, guys, okay? That, my friends, is how you install ball joints correctly so that you don't have memory steer and so that your ball joints live a long, happy life. As I said a few minutes ago, a lot of people give ball joints a bad reputation. It's like so many things that we deal with in our lives, like high lift jacks and all sorts of other stuff, that people just don't understand how to use them properly, and sometimes parts are crap. But most of the time, it's user or installer error. And ball joints are exactly that, right? They have their limits. They're meant to wear, okay? Again, I'm not gonna say something like a ball joint delete isn't better. It is. It's more heavy duty. It'll last longer, but they're way more expensive. They're harder to install. These ball joints made by Moog, okay? They're greasable. I'll put the grease fittings in, pump a couple of squirts of grease into them because they do come pre-greased. And again, guys, this is how easily, I mean, look at this. Watch, one finger, okay? One finger. That's what your ball joint is supposed to do. So if you can barely turn it with two hands, putting opposite pressure on it, and the shop says, oh, drive it for a couple thousand miles. Guys, all you're doing is wearing that inner cup on that ball joint, and that's why, okay? If you look, right, I have a little bit of a gap here on this one. I have a little bit of a gap on this one, and you can see how that flat edge actually made contact over here and it moved away over here. It actually rotated as I was tightening this to 69 pound-feet. If you hammer that down in there and that's not free to move like that, it's gonna bind up your ball joint, take a lot of its life expectancy away, put a lot of abuse on other components on your vehicle. Your steering is not meant to handle that kind of load and pressure. That right there is how you do it. So guys, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, share it with your buddies, tell everybody about it, because I haven't seen a video that shows how to actually do that step to get rid of your memory steer, right? But that's what causes it, and that's how you fix it. All right, guys. Anyway, get out there and build something.